So we have time for questions. Maybe I'll take a few and then we'll have another round. Questions, comments? Go ahead, Janine.
Yeah, I really enjoyed your talk. I was wondering if you could maybe reflect a little bit more on how, and I'm going to go back to the mantra, thinking about, kind of phases in development and kind of, the technologies of knowledge that underpin, for example, modernization theory as opposed to, for example, neoliberalism, and how, in a sense, the colonization of social science thinking and development thinking by classical economics has intensified or differently shaped the exclusion or silencing or the disposition of race in discourse. And what I'm thinking about in particular, I think, is probably in processes of individualization, but also the writing out of structure altogether in terms of thinking about development.
Yeah.
Okay. Laurie?
Well, it's a big one. Okay.
Right. Big one.
For some strange reason, Samuel Huntington in Clash of Civilizations kept leaping to my mind towards the end of your talk there. But what I wanted to ask you about was, it seems to be particularly salient in the UK, this new kind of, relatively new discourse of civil society building and governance in terms of development agencies and their framing of the work they're doing. And it applies both to Eastern Europe, interestingly, and to Latin America and other places. And I wondered if you'd had an opportunity to look at the way culture is used in that civil society building discourse, because it just seems quite to have taken over in some ways from earlier forms of development discourse.
Those two?
Sure.
Two big ones.
Two big ones. Well, I'll start with the second, if that's all right. The civil society discourse, I think, is it's a really interesting question because it has, like participation in the 80s and in empowerment and gender and development. I think it's become now, one of the primary sort of foci, I suppose, of development interventions.
Organizations like Civitas and so based in
UK. Yeah, exactly. Well, I think there's different perceptions about how and why civil society has become privileged in the way in which it has in development. And I think there's one group of people who would argue very strongly that most people don't meet their needs through the state and the market on a daily, on a mundane level. Most people meet their needs through civil society. And nobody is completely excluded. It's it'd be very difficult for us to find somebody who's completely socially excluded, sitting somewhere with no social interaction at all. So most people have some kind of social relationship, and that civil society discourses would emerge out of social development thinking in the sense that most people meet their daily needs not from the state and the market, but from faith-based organisations, family, community in different ways. And therefore we need to strengthen civil society, which has been the missing middle between the state and the market. And I think there's another group of people who might argue very strongly that the emphasis in the World Bank and other donor agencies on civil society and social capital has been to reduce resource claims on the state. So building social capital, building civil society so that people don't now lay claim to resources from the social security net, the welfare state. You're looking.
I could go a lot further than that. Really, a lot of this seems to be connected to underpinning liberal democratic political institutions and market institutions. That seems to be the fit of civil society, conception of civil society.
Well, I think it was. I think that's absolutely right. And when that sort of the triangle of state, market, civil society, and then definitely this institutional frame that the individual in the centre. I think that civil society was that sort of net where the state didn't or couldn't provide, and the market was failing. And I think that civil society was part of that net those individuals. However, I think it's very much part of the neoliberal discourse, which focuses on the rolling back of the state and investing, all kinds of resources and services within the market. So I don't know whether that answered your question. Well, I just think it's another buzzword. I mean, I think social capital is, in a way, a much more interesting term that's emerged from that civil society discussion, because it really is, so that they could play with the economists. And so social capital was a way in which the social could now become part of an arena or a sphere that economists might engage with. So it's not just civil society, it's social capital. It's something that you can have, and it's a resource, and you can build it, and you can exchange it, and it fits into a neoliberal discourse around the markets. That would be my take on social capital. And there are many people in development who wouldn't use the term social capital. Feel that it conceals actually all kinds of relations between people, social relations between people. And the writing out of structure, that's a huge question, and a very important one. And I think that in most development research, funded development research anyway, and in most development policy in practice, there is very, very, very little thinking about structure. And I think, although independency in world systems theories in the 70s clearly embedded in some notions about structure, over the last 20 years, I think that's gone. And I think part of that is that alternative and radical discourses, or those discourses that began from a radical perspective on the margins of development, such as participation, that clearly has its roots much before, Robert Chambers started talking about, farmer first and putting first last and the last first. It has a much longer history than that. But when it becomes prioritised within development, I think it becomes co-opted into a mainstream and loses its radical edge. So in mainstream development discourse, you don't hear the term feminism, but you hear gender and development. So that what starts out, like Diane Elson in feminist economics and other people who start out with these sort of radical discourses, very quickly get co-opted into the mainstream, primarily through the discourse of the World Bank and other agencies. And as they do that, they lose their radical edge, and they become part of the mainstream in a way that abstracts them out of any understanding of structural inequalities. And I think that's the process that's going on. It's very hard to remain on the margins of development, which is interesting because things are kept on the margins, but I think there's a co-optation, a process of co-optation that goes on, and that they become adapted. So now, inequalities that emerge out of the critiques, feminist critiques, for example, can be reduced to the Harvard Analytical Gender Framework, or Caroline Moses Gender Framework, and that it becomes a technical process rather than a political one. So it's about getting the technique right. It's about asking women to fill out 24-hour clocks. It's about looking at the gender division of labour, looking at who makes decisions within the household, which are important, but it becomes reduced to that practical, putting a well closer to where women require water, rather than trying to think through, well, why is there a division of labour whereby certain groups of women certain groups of people are responsible for the collection of water and others aren't. So it's much more about a practical need rather than something more strategic and structural.
Agreed. Yeah. So we'll just take another round. So we have Rob and Megan. Are there other questions? Okay, and Sarah.
I thought you made a very compelling argument about the ways in which the colonial history is written out of development. I'm just curious, though, could you say a bit more sort of concretely about how the colonial administrators you worked with in the research, how they make sense of their own participation in that re-articulation of race into development? What kind of ways they make sense of that?
Megan?
Thanks. I really enjoyed your talk, and I'm curious about a lot of